The reveal of Reynatis had me hooked from day one. With a script penned by Final Fantasy VII writer Kazushige Nojima, a soundtrack scored by Final Fantasy XV and Kingdom Hearts composer Yoko Shimomura, and a design that heavily referenced the long-abandoned Final Fantasy Versus XIII, I was fully behind this new project. The staff and atmosphere were no coincidence. The developers explicitly stated that Versus XIII and The World Ends With You were direct influences on the world they wanted to create. Indeed, this even received the blessing of the creator of both of those projects, as Tetsuya Nomura from Square Enix gave his blessing and endorsed an official, canonical crossover event between The World Ends With You in-game in Reynatis. Cut to the present, and I am very regrettably disappointed. The Final Fantasy Versus XIII spiritual successor unfortunately lacks any soul. Reynatis is where fantasy meets reality, says developer Furyu. The game is set in a modern-day Shibuya, where some people have started to manifest magical powers and are known as wizards. People fear magic in this world, and wizards are outlawed, so they must conceal their identities in public, lest people report a wizard sighting as deviant behaviour on the City Watch app. While some wizards try to live free as members of the guild, others join law enforcement as Shibuya's anti-wizard task force, the MEA, and they hunt down and rehabilitate stray wizards on the street. To explore each side, the game features dual protagonists. Marin, a young wizard hoping to become more powerful so as to be free, and Sari, the cop. As well as their own personal struggles, we're introduced to the concept of rubrum, or rub, which is essentially a magic drug that can slowly turn people into addicts, and finally, monsters. There's not much development of the main characters beyond these central premises. Each character is accompanied by several party members, each of whom have a tenuous link to their respective protagonist. Although there is dialogue between party members, it is fairly uninspiring, and largely occurs as optional text messages in an app accessed from your menu, buried in a confusing non-chronological list of messages. While the story and setting are Reynatis' strongest points, it leaves a lot to be desired. There is simply not enough of an exploration of the complex themes introduced here beyond the superficial implications you would assume from such a setting. I would even go so far as to say the issue of drug addiction is tackled rather poorly, as the only option to deal with people addicted to rub is essentially to smite them before they turn into literal monsters if they haven't already. There is at least an attempt to cut off the supply of drugs from the city to stop others falling foul, but I found myself fairly uninterested in any particular characters, with my main motivation to finish being the hopes that something interesting happens in the wider world towards the end of the game. Yoko Shimomura delivers a couple of typically brilliant pieces here. Think of the orchestra, classical piano and choir combo of Final Fantasy XV's best moments, and you'll be in the same headspace she was when she composed some of these themes. I say a couple of pieces because there's very little music in this game. In fact, the digital soundtrack only has 6 tracks, and I can't really think of any pieces in-game that aren't on that soundtrack. Half of those are fairly basic background music for wandering the city. Many have commented on the PS2 era visuals, and while I feel strongly that not every game needs to have AAA hyper-realistic visuals, Reynatis does feel a bit rough around the edges in places, with particularly lazy and generic lip flap and nothing to interact with. Combat animations do seem slick, smooth and appropriately flashy, and overall character and art design is fairly good. It seems like great care has gone into recreating Shibuya quite faithfully as well. The level design, however, leaves a lot to be desired. Exploring Shibuya is limited to picking up inconsequential amounts of money and jumping between 2 to 3 side quests per chapter, all of which involve killing either a monster or a drug addict. As you complete more side quests and rid the city of those pesky drug addicts, you will reduce the level of malice in the city and be able to access some new abilities by examining wizard, street art made to improve the skills of wizards who examine it. So there is at least a crumb of incentive to explore the city and complete some side quests. When you're not trekking from one street to the next for some dissatisfying side quests, you might find yourself in the Another dimension. The dimension is literally called Another, which consists of a corridor of forest paths with the occasional pocket on the map to fight the same 4 enemy designs, until you reach the end of the path to fight one of the same 4 recurrent boss monsters. More on that later. The forest paths are flat, poorly textured, empty and repetitive, and for some reason they also disable the function to look at the whole map in the menu, so you don't quite have a sense of how much longer you're going to be stuck here. Anyone hoping to find a silver lining in the game's visuals and level design will be left wanting. The themes of suppression and liberation of magic users are woven into the combat in an initially interesting way, and it's not too hard to see the outline of a coherent attempt to have the story impact on the gameplay. In suppression mode, you cannot attack and move more slowly, but you can evade and absorb magic. With enough magic stored, you can enter liberation mode, where you remove your hood, unsheath your weapon, and go to town on the baddies. Entering liberation mode with a full magic gauge triggers burst mode, which freezes enemies for a short while, similar to witch time in Bayonetta. Your magic gauge will deplete over time and runs out faster the more you use attacks, so you are forced to switch between offensive and defensive play, as well as tagging in your party members to keep up momentum. In theory, this all sounds very good, but it doesn't quite stick the landing. Narratively, there isn't much point in suppressing in the middle of a battle with a giant monster intent on killing you, so being forced into suppression mode can take momentum out of the fight for no good reason. When you are actually fighting, you're limited to mashing the attack button or using one of two equipable magic abilities at a time. You can increase the power and effect of these abilities in the character screens and acquire new abilities as the story progresses, but my experience is that the abilities do just as much, if not less, damage in the same period of time that mashing the attack button would achieve, with the additional frustration of simply depleting the magic gauge more quickly than standard attacks. The camera and enemy targeting does often misbehave, especially in some of the narrow corridors, so be prepared to be mashing buttons and not even being rewarded with the flashy attack animations on many occasions. All of that combines to mean that the combat look is very button mashy with no real skill, depth or variety until you're forced into suppression or another character again. If you run out of magic, you can just stand still and be given a generous amount of time to trigger your evasion and magic absorption to restart the gameplay loop. To pour salt on the wound, there is a distinct lack of enemy variety, and you'll find yourself fighting the same handful of designs around every corner. All the drug addicts and thugs and cops look the same as the next group, and while there are a few monsters with not uninteresting designs, you'll only see a small range. The particular sting in the tail is that some end-of-level bosses are extremely repetitive. I have already fought the Titan on at least 5 separate occasions as a boss, and then again a few times in pairs as an apparently normal battle. Recurrent bosses are fine if there's a reason to keep fighting them again, but this was just unapologetically lazy and uninspired. I've never been a great cook. Sometimes I follow a recipe to the letter, get the best quality ingredients and slave away over the cooker, only to taste a plain dinner after all that effort. Just like my home cooking, I'm not quite sure what went wrong with Reynatis. Despite the quality ingredients and preparation, the developers have managed to produce something incredibly bland. The reality of this fantasy is that it is thoroughly disappointing.